Thank you all so much for coming. Before I get started, I have 3 questions for the audience. The first question is, just out of curiosity, how many people here came from outside of the United States? Could you please raise your hands? All right, a few people I see. Okay, very nice. The second question is, how many people came today from the United States? Would you be willing to raise your hands? All right, quite a good crowd. Thank you. And the third question is, who here is conscious? Could you please raise your hands? Okay, if you raised your hand in response to that final question, that means that my talk should be relevant to your life. So that's the good news. So the title of my talk is Solving the Hard Problem of Conscious Experience, a Vedic Approach. But before I get into the problem, I want to start with what we can agree on. Pretty much everyone agrees that our brains, our physical brains, support our subjective experiences. In other words, there is a correspondence between the physical processes that occur in our brains and our mental processes, meaning our thoughts, emotions, and perceptions. So when certain regions of the brain are active, we have experiences associated with those regions. And neuroscientists have made progress, quite a lot of progress, in identifying the nature of these correlations, in discovering which regions of the brain support which types of subjective experiences. However, some fundamental questions still remain. Essentially, how and why? How does a material brain give rise to subjective experience? Why are we conscious in the first place? Because brains are made of matter. And if you look up the word matter in the dictionary, you'll find things like the fact that it's a physical substance, that it occupies space, that it has rest mass. There's nothing in that definition to suggest the capacity for conscious experience, to suggest that matter can have a first-person perspective, a point of view, thoughts, emotions, perceptions. And most of us wouldn't expect to have such things coming from, say, a rock or a table. So how is it that our brains, which are also made of matter, can give rise to subjective experience? That's a question that remains even with the most advanced scientific discoveries, which have elaborated on the correlations between physical and mental processes. So what I'm essentially getting at is called the hard problem of conscious experience. That even if we successfully explain the physical processes that accompany all mental processes, we still won't have explained the origin of subjective experience. So even if we come up with a perfect one-to-one correspondence between the physical events that occur in our brains and our mental processes, we won't have addressed why we're conscious in the first place. So to give some examples, if we look at a red flower, you can describe that event in physical terms, in terms of sensory impulses and neuronal impulses. But that description won't address the fact that that flower appears to have a rich redness to it. It has a distinctive characteristic, a qualia, that is available to the perceiver. And a neuroscientist studying that person's brain would not be able to tell from the outside that first-hand experience. They would not be able to tell the rich redness of that flower. They might notice that a region of the brain associated with the color red was active, but they wouldn't know that subjective quality of the flower. So what we're saying is subjective experiences do not seem to be reducible to physical terms. There's something above and beyond the physical, even though they correspond with physical events. The same thing may be said of pain. If you touch a hot stove, you can describe that event in physical terms, in terms of sensory impulses and neuronal impulses. But you haven't addressed why it has a subjective quality, why it hurts so much. Pain just does not seem to be reducible to physical terms. So some quotations about the hard problem of conscious experience, as I'm calling it. One by biologist Thomas Huxley, who in 1868 wrote, "But what consciousness is, we know not, and how it is that anything so remarkable as a state of consciousness comes about as the result of irritating nervous tissue is just as unaccountable as the appearance of the jinn when Aladdin rubbed his lamp in the story, or as any other ultimate fact of nature." In short, if you look at nervous tissue, you would never expect it to have a first-person subjective experience. That seems almost magical, given the prevailing worldview, the physicalist worldview. And this problem has persisted over the years. We see in 2002 that philosopher Alvin Noe wrote, "After decades of concerted effort on the part of neuroscientists, psychologists, and philosophers, only one proposition about how the brain makes us conscious, how it gives rise to sensation, feeling, subjectivity, has emerged unchallenged. We don't have a clue." So again, we have made progress in identifying correlations. We have not really made progress on these fundamental issues regarding how a material brain can produce subjective experience. So this is called the explanatory gap, that on the one hand we have neurons firing, on the other hand we have subjective experience, which is an everyday feature of our lives. But there's something missing in the center, some explanation needed to indicate how we get from one to the other. So how problematic is this hard problem of conscious experience? Here I want to turn to a quote by philosopher Jae-gwon Kim, who is a leading voice in philosophy of mind. It's a little long, but I think it's worth it. He writes, "To most of us, a fulfilling life, a life worth living, is one that is rich and full in qualitative consciousness. We would regard life as impoverished and not fully satisfying if it never included experiences of things like the smell of the sea in a cool morning breeze, the lambent play of sunlight on brilliant autumn foliage, the fragrance of a field of lavender in bloom, and the vibrant, layered soundscape projected by a string quartet. It is an ironic fact that the felt qualities of conscious experience, perhaps the only things that ultimately matter to us, are often relegated in the rest of philosophy to the status of secondary qualities, in the shadowy zone between the real and the unreal, or even jettisoned outright as artifacts of confused minds." So in a nutshell, what Kim is saying is that many scholars have been content to minimize, ignore, or deny the existence of subjective experience because it doesn't fit neatly within the mainstream physicalist paradigm. And yet, subjective experience makes life worth living. It's hard to imagine being alive without it. So it seems crucial to develop a deeper understanding of the nature and origin of our subjectivity. Now let's turn to a Vedic approach to solving the hard problem of conscious experience. And specifically, I will be looking at the consciousness-based paradigm of Marishi Vedic science. This paradigm was articulated by Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, a scientist of consciousness and an exponent of Vedic knowledge. And it's a science in the sense that it provides a technique for systematically investigating the nature of one's own consciousness. That technique is the transcendental meditation technique. This is a tool for discovering subtler and subtler layers of one's own consciousness. So according to the consciousness-based paradigm, the brain is not the ultimate source of our conscious experience. The brain is involved, but the ultimate source is a universal field of pure consciousness, a field of pure intelligence, creative intelligence that is present everywhere, and that the consciousness of all living beings are an expression of this field. And Maharishi Vedic science identifies this field of pure consciousness with the unified field described by modern physics. Modern physicists talk about a unified field that is present everywhere that gives rise to the material universe. And so it's the claim of Maharishi Vedic science that these two fields are in fact two sides of the same coin. They are ultimately one and the same. That the source of all subjectivity is the same as the source of objective reality. So you can see that drawn in the diagram above. The question is, how does the brain fit into this picture? And here Maharishi Mahesh Yogi provides a useful analogy. He talks about the sun shining on a glass of liquid and producing a reflection. You can see a drawing up there. And in this analogy, the sun symbolizes the field of pure consciousness. The glass of liquid represents the individual nervous system, especially the brain. And the reflection on the surface of the glass symbolizes individual subjective experience. So to recap, pure consciousness shines on the individual nervous system and produces a reflection, which is individual subjective experience. Now this is an analogy, it's not meant to be taken literally, but it's a way to conceptualize of a universal field becoming localized in an individual nervous system, becoming reflected or filtered, whatever word you want to use, in that location. And you can see in this analogy that the condition of the glass of water is going to influence the condition of the reflection. So if that glass is full of dirty water, you're going to get a distorted reflection. If the glass is bright and clear, you'll get a clear reflection. And this is bringing out the point that the quality of our subjective experiences does depend in large part on the state of our physiology. If we're tired, this is going to affect our subjective experiences. If we have one portion of the brain is active, then we'll have experiences associated with that region. And if in unfortunate cases, if there's brain damage, then that region of the brain would be expected to, that region of consciousness would be expected to function differently. So what I'm saying is this model provides a useful way of accounting for the mind-brain correlations that we described earlier. It asserts that there is an intimate relationship between the physical processes going on in our brains and our mental processes, just as we have seen through scientific evidence. And simply because any change in the reflector produces a change in the reflection. Any change in the individual nervous system or in the brain produces a change in subjective experience. What this model is adding is the presence of pure consciousness in the picture, this universal field. So how does Maharishi Vedic science solve the hard problem of conscious experience? Well, we got into this problem by asking the question, how does the brain create conscious experience? The answer, according to Maharishi Vedic science, is it doesn't, in the sense that the brain is not the ultimate origin of our subjectivity. The brain, again, is intimately involved, it's very important, but the ultimate source would be this field of pure consciousness. So this solution would be useful in avoiding the assumption that the brain must be the ultimate source of our conscious experience. That seems to be the assumption that has gotten us into the problem in the first place. Perhaps our subjective experiences are not reducible to the physical, they're not explicable in physical terms, because their ultimate origin is not physical either. It's this field of pure consciousness that underlies the physical world. So I'll conclude with a quote by Sir Francis Bacon, known as the father of empiricism. Bacon wrote, "The world is not to be narrowed till it will go into the understanding, but the understanding to be expanded and opened till it can take in the image of the world as it is in fact." So in other words, rather than trying to cram the world into a particular narrow template that we understand, we need to fit our template to the world as it actually is. And subjective experience is clearly a part of that world. And so it seems we need a paradigm that does better justice to this phenomenon as something that is not reducible to the physical, that goes beyond the physical. And Maharishi Vedic science may provide a solution to that issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Krista. It was a very serious paper, but presented in a very lucid style based on the Maharishi Vedic sciences. And she was solving the hard problem of experiencing consciousness. And if there is any question or query, you may ask.
Thank you very much for your nice talk. So you talked about consciousness and you termed it hard problem of consciousness, but you have not told what is easy problem of consciousness and whether it is yet solved. In a modern science, we talk about easy problem of consciousness and hard problem of consciousness.
Yes.
So we have not yet even solved the easy problem of consciousness. And second thing is that you are quoting Vedic scriptures, but you are trying to reduce the personality to consciousness only. But Vedic science talks about Sat, Chit and Ananda. So you want to reduce everything to only Chit, consciousness, which is also not correct. So you have to present a full picture if you are, if you want to represent the Vedic, system properly. And also in modern science, it is already recognized in terms of, plants or bacteria, they don't have brain organ. So brain is not the source of consciousness, is not now well understood. And there is a project called Human Hair Transplantation Project, which also represents that brain is not the source of consciousness.
Thank you very much. There's several facets to that, and I'll try to respond to all of them. With regards to emphasizing Chit and Sat Chit Ananda, in that case, this whole time I've been elaborating on the consciousness-based paradigm of Maharishi Vedic science. Maharishi Mahesh Yogi most of the time uses the term pure consciousness. He may use other descriptors, but that's his most consistent usage of it. So as I'm expressing his paradigm, I want to use his terminology. And certainly the nature of pure consciousness as conscious has backing in the Vedic literature. As to the difference between the easy problems and the hard problems, yes. The easy problems are things like how the brain can figure out stimuli, how it can discern its environment. There are issues regarding how the brain functions and produces particular types of subjective experiences. And it's true that there are many questions remaining here. But I wanted to emphasize something that I think is much more fundamental in nature, which is where does conscious experience come from at all, rather than just how does the brain produce this particular effect. So it seemed like a relevant way to narrow my focus, given that I only had 20 minutes.
Okay.
And then, could you remind me one more time of the third part of your question?
About, the organs like, plants and,
Oh.
they don't have brain organ, yet they are conscious entities.
Well, I personally agree with you that they have
no,
conscious...
Science agrees it. You study about bacterial consciousness, plant consciousness, there is a lot of, literature already published in biological journals.
I believe that there's movement in that direction. It's, to my understanding, definitely not a consensus among scientists that plants have consciousness. I was talking to a neuroscientist friend, actually, just a few weeks ago. She's working...
Plant signaling.
I'm
Journal
sorry?
of Plant signaling.
What?
Journal of Plant signaling.
Okay.
Plant signaling.
Okay. I believe you that there is evidence coming out in this nature. I believe you that science is making progress. I think it would be a misassessment to say that scientists are agreed that plants have consciousness. Just the other day I was talking to my neuroscientist friend who was saying that she actually found it laughable even to consider that idea. So I don't think it's a consensus yet, but I'm glad to hear that there's more and more progress in that arena.
Light being a particle as well as a wave created a new quantum field of physics. But according to the Vedic studies, we are a particle, we are a flow, we are a wave, all three. The wave part hasn't come yet, so to be complete. consciousness, I want to understand whether you and I are on the same plane. Consciousness, I mean, are we talking about the awareness, witness, sakshibhut aspect? Like when we are hearing a sound, when I am hearing you, listening to you, it is not my earlobes that are hearing. It is not the auditory canal. It is not my drum. It is not my auditory nerve. It is not my auditory center in the brain. Something in me is hearing, and that is pure awareness or consciousness. I call that consciousness in the Sahaja Yoga. But are we on the same plane? Are you calling that consciousness, or are you calling something different as consciousness?
I'm having a little trouble hearing everything you're saying. Are you saying the witnessing quality within an individual person, like that would develop in higher states of consciousness where you're aware of your own experiences as they occur? Is that what you're talking about by witnessing quality? I'm not quite sure what you mean by witnessing quality, so I'm not sure how to answer your question. Okay. Sure.
What he's saying is that, first of all, you did a phenomenal job of,
Oh,
talking about it. Congratulations.
thank you.
Common theme is, we are talking about the Vedic
Yes.
within the Vedic tradition, and I have personally experienced.
Mm-hmm.
Upanishads say that try to focus on who listens, not the physical part.
Mm-hmm.
Try to concentrate on who witnesses, not the eye part.
Yes.
And try to witness that what speaks, not the mouth or
Mm-hmm.
inside, right?
Yes.
I'm also almost certain, I've not studied Marishi Yogi and I'm still interpreting his question, that when he talks about consciousness, he's talking about Karan Sharif, the casual Sharif, casual body, which is
नहीं करेंगे
and the last is the school Sharif,
उधर बोल इस सेशन को बोल
it's the three combined
उधर वाला
that talk
सेशन को
about
बोल
mind and everything else.
उनका है
So what he's trying to say is that when you talk about the consciousness of that team and you are on the same plane,
Mm-hmm.
are you talking about the consciousness, which is a combination of all the three, and the true self that listens, speaks, and sees, which is conscious, not necessarily the pure physical part of the three things that
Oh, I see.
Seeing the seer, hearing the hearer, touching the toucher, feeling the feeler. That is what I mean by consciousness.
Okay.
the Vedic tradition is, that's the interpretation of Vedic.
Yes. Well, I am talking about the ultimate experiencer that every individual is experiencing through their nervous system, but that ultimately is the individualization, the localization, the filtering of the self that is in all things, and that is that which ultimately hears, which ultimately smells, which ultimately tastes. I hope that answers the question.
That's a good answer that is your
Okay,
some of us,
I see.
but that's it.
Yeah, this is indeed a gathering of learned scholars, and there are so many opinions, and very deep and very serious opinions are presented by all of you. But I will also appreciate her presentation because she has very precisely touched a particular point and elaborated that only.
Thank you.